The next session is The Beginnings of a New Cinema and Chidananda Dasgupta. And it features Aparna Sen, Kalyan Ray, and Samik Bandyopadhyay, where they discuss the film society movement and Chidananda Das' role in the spread of a new cinema in India. The moderator for this session is Raju Raman. Let me quickly tell you a little more about all the participants before we start the session. Aparna Sen, filmmaker, actor, has received multiple accolades, including several National Film Awards and a Padma Shri. She is the daughter of the critic and filmmaker Chidananda Dasgupta, whose centennial year we are marking today with this session. She made her film debut at the age of 15 as Mrinmoyee in Samapti, part of Teen Kanya, directed by Satyajit Ray. And some of her notable directorial works include 36 Chowringhee Lane, Parama, Yugant, Paromitar Ek Din, Mr. and Mrs. Iyer, 15 Park Avenue, many, many more. I apologize in advance for my inappropriate pronunciation of some of the titles. Kalyan Ray is an Indian-American writer who has lived and taught in several countries where he was a visiting professor of comparative theology. He collaborated with Mother Teresa on the translations and voiceover for the first documentary on her work. He is the author of the novel Eastwards, No Country, and has translated several books of contemporary Indian poetry into English, some of which are City of Memories, Emperor Babur's Prayer, and the Grey Manuscript. Ray has been teaching literature in the US and divides his time between the USA and India. Samik Bandyopadhyay is a scholar, editor, publisher, translator, lexicographer, and bibliophile. And if you wonder if anything has been left out from the literary and cultural world, he is also member publication committee, Sangeet Natak Akademi, New Delhi. He was the Rabindranath Tagore National Fellow at the School for Arts and Aesthetics, JNU, New Delhi, ICCR Chair at the Department of Theatre Studies, visiting professor, Freie Universität, Berlin, or is that free maybe, I'm not sure, Vice Chairman, National School of Drama, and member, National School of Drama Society. Shamikda is also my senior as a founder editor at Seagull and a very, very notable film scholar and critic, aside from all the theatre credits we just read out. Raju Raman, formerly known as S.V. Raman, retired as Program Officer of the Goethe Institute, Max Miller Bhavan, Kolkata. He is presently Program Consultant at Victoria Memorial Hall. He teaches public speaking, communication, soft skills, and film and German at various institutions. He's a freelance journalist, translator, and interpreter, very closely connected with several social and cultural organizations. He is also a very able moderator, and I look forward to handing the session over to Raju.
It is wonderful to have you here. Shomikta has been here for quite some time now. And in a way, you know, I was listening into the previous session that was going on, and that was all about beyond nostalgia. So I'm just wondering whether from beyond nostalgia, we are plunging straight into nostalgia here in some way or the other. And Anjum, with this kind of a programming for this festival, has hit a double century because this back-to-back session, the previous one and this one, are about two centurions. Because it is perhaps not very widely known that the person whom we are going to talk about now, Chidananda Dasgupta, we are also in his centenary year this year. And they have been contemporaries, Satyajit Ray and Chidananda Dasgupta. And this particular session is going to be devoted to Chidananda Dasgupta's contribution to the film society movement and to the new cinema in India. And given the physical and the biological proximity that Aparna had to this gentleman, I find it in the fitness of things that one starts with her, because when the idea of starting a film society movement, which was perhaps even as a result of some taunts from certain people who said, how come your Calcutta does not have a film society movement yet? There are two already in Bombay, is when people thought that there should be one in Calcutta, and the seeds of the Calcutta Film Society were sown. That was almost coinciding with the year of independence of our country, India, a time when Aparna Sen was possibly just beyond her toddling stage. But still, we would like to know from you, whatever you have preserved by way of memory, what was it like? Or did you understand anything about what was going on? Or in retrospect, can you make sense of what all that hullabaloo was about at that period of time?
Raju, I don't remember anything. I couldn't have been beyond the talking stage because I really don't remember anything at all, except that ever since I had begun to become aware of things, I knew that there was a film society. I mean, there was a film society of which my parents were members. This much I knew. And there were other members as well, but I think the stage at which I really began to get interested was when I must have been about 8 or 9. And, my parents would take us to see all kinds of films, a lot of which we didn't understand. In retrospect, I think that not understanding was, that not understanding didn't mean anything negative. What it meant was that we were exposed, no matter whether we understood or not, we were exposed. Sometimes we asked them questions about it later on and they answered. But basically what happened was that, in a musician's house, how you find toddlers and even, beyond toddlers, sort of running around, but they know most of the ragas. They know the sargam of the ragas. It's because of exposure. So that is actually what happened to us. This is what I remember. And what I remember very well is that we had a house, Baba's quarters or whatever from Imperial Tobacco, where he was working then, where there was a large apartment and it had a very large veranda leading out onto a garden. And this veranda is where, with an 8mm or a 16mm camera, mostly 8mm, lots of films from all over the world were projected on the wall. I mean, no, I think there was a projector. There was a screen that was set up, and there was a projector which used to project these films on the wall. And I remember seeing Battleship Potemkin, Ivan the Terrible, Passion of Joan of Arc, and films like that, even some films of Bergman's. And very early on, we saw films like Red Beard, we saw films like, Kurosawa's Rashomon. These were very early memories. Of course, I saw them later again, several times, but these were some of the early memories.
But the people who gathered around for these sessions, because the 8mm was probably the predecessor of the VHS in those days, right? And the kind of people who gathered for these shows and to talk about these shows, do you remember anything about the people who used to gather around?
I remember the regular people of the society. I don't know their last names because I used to call everybody Kaka, Kaping Kaka, Pradipto Kaka, Pradipto Sen actually, who is now 90 at this point of time and who perhaps could have joined. Then there was Ashish Sen. There was, he was a poet, writer. And a lot of the time, Manik Kaka, but not in our balcony. Manik Kaka used to come to the shows that were held in various places.
Right.
I can't remember now. I mean, where exactly they were held, I can't remember anymore.
Okay, we'll come back to you. I would like to move on to Shomikda, somebody who knows from A to Z of anything under the sun, you see. So Shomikda is very well aware of what happened during that period. So would you like to throw a little more light on the role of Chidananda Dasgupta in the Film Society movement and later on in promoting the new Indian cinema?
To talk of Chiduda, as we used to call him, and his involvement in what we call the Film Society movement, what is important is that right from the beginning, the very idea of the Film Society movement, as it emerged in 1925 in Britain, the first ever film society, the Film Society, which was the London Film Society, the founder members, interestingly, in 1925, included John Maynard Keynes, J.B.S. Halden, George Bernard Shaw, Virginia Woolf, Roger Fry, outstanding people from different walks of life, from different fields and disciplines, and barely 2 or 3 people totally committedly interested in cinema, like Ivor Montagu and George Grist. So what we have to take stock of is that cinema had opened up the possibility of all the different arts, different fields of knowledge coming together into this single artistic medium. An all-encompassing and all-devouring form. And to be involved in it, to be engaged in it, and to let it flourish and reach the people that it should reach, rather than remain what it was initially, purely and entirely an entertainment medium. That was the concern with which the Film Society movement had started, and that was the concern Satyajit Ray, Chidananda Das Gupta, Radha Prasad Gupta, Subrata Mitra, Bangshi Chandra Gupta, Ashish Barman, all of them together, from their interests in different fields of creativity, in different fields of knowledge, and this new possibility opening up of all these coming together and interacting with one another and becoming a civilizational medium. So that was the provocation. And Chiduda's lifelong interests in the visual arts, in archaeology, in architecture, in the fine art, in poetry, the poetry of Chidananda Das that he translated so brilliantly, all these interests coming together into cinema. And for most of them, initially, it was not so much making a film or becoming filmmakers immediately, but to nurture and to understand, to get deeper into reading films, watching films, getting to the heart of cinema.
And interestingly, Baba wrote this book called Boi Noi Chobi.
Right.
He looked at a film as a text today. My father actually was, what he did not like was the connection that was drawn between cinema and literature in a very literal way. That is what he objected to. When you talk to Ashish Bormon, I remember that's the name I meant, Ashish Bormon, not Ashish Sen. Ashish Bormon used to be there. Subhash Mukhopadhyay would sometimes be there. Then Shanti Chaudhary used to be there. Shanti Chaudhary was not filmmaker, but very interested. So there were a lot of people. And, there were also women. My mother was there. Bijay Rai often came. I know that Rita Rai, that is
Kavita Sarkar.
Kavita Sarkar, that's right. That was a penny. He came. All these people used to come.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, Shobita, you were mentioning about the seeds of the Film Society movement from 1925 and how the various forms of the arts got integrated in this relatively new medium called cinema, which provided the opportunity for the integration of these various art forms. One of the recent articles that we came across, which I had forwarded to you also, Shobita, by Monijendra Majumdar, also throws some light on some of these people who got together at that time. I think, Aparna, you read this article too, didn't you? Right. So it must have been a time where they were trying to build some kind of discourse around cinema, which had to move away from the position of mere entertainment to an art form which merits much more than just viewing a film in the dark in a cinema hall and moving away and then just forgetting about it. So that was the intention possibly with which the film society movement was created. A lot of film societies came up subsequently after the Calcutta Film Society. And 10 years after the Calcutta Film Society was founded, also the various film societies came together under one umbrella and formed a Federation of Film Societies of India on an all India basis to promote this kind of discourse on cinema. But in the 60s and the 70s, it seemed all very hunky-dory that, you know, the film society movement was set up with a particular purpose, and then it was serving that purpose. But do you think, Shomikta, that at some point of time it went wrong or went off track? Why do you think that people like Chidananda Dasgupta felt the need to bring it back on track at some point of time?
One thing you have to remember, Raju, all the time, and this is a concern that comes out very strongly in Chiduda's writings, particularly in the Bangla book that Rina mentioned, Poinoy Chobi, is the continuous tug of war, the continuous pull, contrary pulls of industry, business, the investment that goes into cinema, and the question of fast recovery. And on the other side, the artistic potential of cinema, the creative potential of cinema. So with these contrary pulls, with the more money power that commerce wields, that industry wields, there was always this tendency to take cinema out of the more creative, experimental, adventurous, illuminating part of it to the crass commercial. At one point, Chiduda says in this pieces in Bangla that we turned Satyajit Ray into a god, and we allowed the market from Bombay to take over. We had a god, we'd visit the temple and worship him, but it's the market that ruled. So under that pressure, it was inevitable that unless there was a strong initiative from the end of the Film Society movement, this movement couldn't survive. In fact, something very disturbing I discovered quite recently. Now, one of the standard textbooks, reference books, and academic work, Pam Cook's The Cinema Book, published by the British Film Institute, sponsored by the British Film Institute, created by the British Film Institute, and published by Palgrave Macmillan, one of the leading publishers. It has sections on the different national cinemas. It has a whole section, a whole part devoted to Hong Kong cinema, to Irish cinema. But there is no section devoted to Indian cinema. It is only Hindi cinema. Hong Kong, Irish, Chinese, Swedish, Russian, and then Hindi cinema. And interesting enough, in the standard reference book, read as a text in film schools all over the world and film institutes all over the world, when they choose 5 case studies for the Hindi film, they are Kalia Mardana, Pothir Panchali, Pyasa, Sholay, and Dilwale Dilwaniya Le Jayenge. Just
Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, yeah.
So
you
that
mean
is
to
where
say
things
Pothir Panchali has been clubbed with Hindi cinema over there?
Yes.
That is atrocious.
There is no mention of the rich creativity of films in Marathi, in the South Indian languages, not to speak about that. And this is standard reading material, standard film studies material internationally. That's the strength of industry, where industry also intervenes, as you know, in academia, controls the academic approaches, attitudes, even.
So do you
So
think
how can film society really fight against it unless it really fights?
Yeah, but then to fight against that, probably you need that kind of money power, right? How else you fight it? Do you think this is a result of an act of omission, or do you see any kind of design behind relegating Indian cinema totally from the map of world cinema or national cinemas?
I suspect it's industry trying to wipe out its rivals, something that is always happening in industry. Mm-hmm. You try your best, you try all your resources, your money power, also, to throw your rivals out of the
Aparna, just a second.
I felt, apart from the industry having so much money power that it could just elbow out other kinds of attempts at cinema, there was actually a bit of a letdown from the people who were trying to make what we call parallel cinema at one time. I think around the 60s or so, because what happened was, they were making films that were so abstruse sometimes, so boring sometimes, that people didn't understand and didn't like them. You must remember that when Ray made films, none of these films actually made you care about the characters. Made you care about the characters in the films. But sometimes if you get very abstruse, then it's very difficult. I know experimental cinema needs to be made because the language of cinema develops through that, through experimental cinema. But however, I think at one point, people who wanted to make a different kind of cinema let the movement down.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You say that there were some people who let it down. We shall not take names over here, but certainly not. But you see, going back a little bit, the kind of circumstances under which you grew up, a lot of exposure to world cinema, as you said, some of which you did not understand initially, but later on revisited these films and could make a lot of meaning out of that. But then, apart from the odd break that you got in so-called meaningful cinema, you at that time were working mostly in popular cinema, right? So at home, in the home situation, with Chiduda, how was his acceptance to this situation of you working continuously in a different kind of cinema, whereas he was trying to propagate a different kind of cinema?
So I accepted a film called Opurchito. I will now take name. Because Opurchito was a film I gathered from what they told me about the story and the script, I gathered that it would probably be a hit. I was so upset because I was not getting any roles after Baksho Badal and Akash Kushum that I wanted to join advertising. So my father said advertising is equally a rat race. You must, have sticking power and just wait, it will come. And then when I said I will act in Opurchito, my mother and father were very upset and they didn't want me to act in that kind of film. So I said to them that I have already accepted it. And the thing is that if I wait for Satyajit Ray or Mrinal to give me a film, then I may have to wait forever. I mean, if I have to have a career, I can't have a career without. So then Baba said to Ma told me later that Baba said there's a method in her madness. So just let her do it. And he knew all the while where my heart lay, where my inclinations lay, because we always discussed. We discussed the films we saw, and we saw films together. We used to have our own little film festivals where one week we saw only Antonioni. This kind of thing we used to do. So Baba knew where, but he realized that you can't have a career simply by doing the kind of films he did. That is why I gave it up at one point, because I said I cannot continue. Um, my entire life I cannot be doing films that I don't believe in.
Mm-hmm.
That was in my head, and Baba knew that.
All right. So it was going to come sometime or the other. That he knew, right? Shobita, you know, fighting against all odds, as you already mentioned, uh, there was a question of survival of the film society movement. And the person whom we are discussing today, Chiduda, how would you evaluate his contribution by way of his writings, by way of later on trying to make also films of a different kind to the cause for which they had started the Film Society movement in the first place?
I'll focus on 2 points specifically. One was that Chiduda had recognized very early, and people in the film society all over the world recognized it quite early, that the documentary cinema offers a different space, a different area, where it's not recording the reality as it is, interpreting it, reading a different meanings into that. That possibility remained there. And at the same time, there would be the opportunity of sponsorship and support. And great work had been done by people like Grierson, Basil Wright, Carol Reed, Anna Substorff, etc., etc., etc. And Chiduda, right at the beginning of the Film Society movement, made the first Film Society film in India, which was his Portrait of a City, right, with the Calcutta Film Society, and it was taken over by the Films Division. So that was an entry point for the Film Society movement in direct filmmaking. And when we talk about the beginning of a new cinema, in Britain particularly, and even in the Soviet Union, the documentary plays a very important role. Looking at reality away from entertainment, looking at reality more intensely, more probingly than the opportunities available in the commercial cinema. That is an entry point, an important entry point where the film society becomes alive and creative and contributing to the film stream. That was one area in which Chiduda played a very significant role. And later on, he became one of our major documentary filmmakers with Dance of Shiva, the Steel film, the Biju Maharaj film, etc., etc., etc. So that was one area. The other area, his writing about cinema, particularly in Bangla. All of us who have written in Bangla, I started writing in the 60s. He was one of our masters. Satyajit Ray and Chiduda, they were the two major models, the major critics who gave us the language, the Bangla in which we could write and talk about cinema seriously and probingly. So that was another thing through which, through the language, through the writing, cinema, the points of cinema, the charm of cinema, the magic of cinema, the art of cinema reaches out to the people. So these were the two major areas in which the Film Society was becoming not just institutionalized, but becoming popular, coming into the mainstream of ideas and thought in the current writing. And these sparked off, their writing sparked off the film societies, the film clubs, and not just in Kolkata, but all over the state, in small towns particularly, where easy access to cinema. Even now, when we talk of this great exposure, everybody has VHS, everybody can watch films the way he likes. It's not true in a poor country like ours. There is this sprawling, huge mafussil where the access is not that easy. No question of idealizing or romanticizing. So the place for film societies still remains there. And I know particularly when we are talking to, I believe, a Shantiniketan audience, from 2000 to 2014, Shantiniketan had a wonderful film society called Bikon, right, which was incidentally inaugurated by Mrinal Sen, who came down to Shantiniketan with his personal print of his Indo-French film Genesis, screened it, and led a discussion on that. Later on, my friend Adu Gopalakrishnan and my friend Girish Kasaravelli also visited the Bikon Film Society for their annual international film festivals. And for all those 14 years in Shantiniketan, they had an international film festival from films that came for the Kolkata International Film Festival and a film appreciation course. A film appreciation course, again, that also realized for us one of Chidananda's dreams. Chidananda always felt that the way to save cinema, the new cinema, from the jaws of commerce was to stick to the arts, the visuality, the richness of visual art in cinema, explore that and get into that rather than the boy, the text, the literary text, the chobi, the visual. That was his life's concern. And that came to be realized in Bikon, because every year when I came for the film appreciation course, the new entrants in the Kala Bhavana, the bright young students of the visual arts, they were part of the film appreciation course. They felt that it was part of their learning experience. And there, cinema was drawing on the arts, and cinema was fighting back the crass routine of the commercial cinema. And that possibility had been nurtured and brilliantly explored in Shantiniketan itself. Those memories still haunt me.
Yes, Bikon is a case in point, certainly. I can certainly point out some other such examples too, but we'll come back to that. But meanwhile, moving on to Aparna, you see, Shantiniketan has just been mentioned. And the question of visual arts, the way Chidananda was propagating that, you need to bring in the visual arts in a very big way in cinema to make them also liked by the people or to make them acceptable to the people. So to what extent do you think that, his kind of Shantiniketan connection, which was also an abode of his, had contributed to the nurturing and promoting of such ideas?
Well, Baba, in the beginning, I think, when when my father was in Calcutta, then he would go to Shantiniketan and so on and, get involved in all this. But then he went to for a very long time to Delhi. When he came back to Shantiniketan, by that time, Sonita, correct me if I'm wrong, by that time the film society, I think, had sort of,
You are trying to say lost its sting.
Yeah, even in Kolkata, we tried to revive it again, many of us, but it had lost its. It's very sad because now there are no more discussions on cinema, except through blogs and so on. Now it's not there. What has taken the place of discussions on cinema together after a movie has been seen, and you talk to director, there are Q&A sessions, and other scholars come and talk, or scholars interview the director, which is really quite wonderful. What has taken the place of that is now bloggers. I mean, well, sadly or otherwise, at least there is some discussion. But Baba, when he came back to Shanti, but he was actually, you mentioned his interest in architecture. I showed that in anything. His interest in architecture and so on. Baba became very involved with INTAC at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And, he was involved in Pipresi. At one point, he was the president of Pipresi. And then, of course, I think after a while, he named Vasudeva and he came away. He came away to Shantiniketan. By that time, I think, Samik, by that time, the Film Society had sort of, was on its last legs, or am I wrong?
2000 to 2014 was the big con period. I checked.
No, but Aparna was just
In
mentioning the
Shantiniketan.
Pipresi, right? The Pipresi was another platform which had the opportunity to promote cinema of a different kind. And when people were writing about thought-provoking cinema which could trigger off a discussion. And I think that also contributed in a major way. And he was at the helm of affairs of Pipresi for quite a while too. I also remember the period when he was the arts editor at the Telegraph later on in the 90s and created a space for discussion on cinema particularly. Now, which is something that we have sadly lost today, because that kind of space is no longer available for any kind of discourse or discussion on cinema, which is why people have taken to blogging as an alternative to talk about the kind of cinema they would like to talk about, or online magazines which are giving a little bit of space to these kind of things. Now, Shomikda, you talked about Big Con. I can think of another example also of a celluloid chapter in Jamshedpur, which was doing a wonderful job of promoting the cause of the Film Society movement, right? Now, if we move away from the mainstream Calcutta, and as Aparna said, that probably the Film Society movement had lost its sting at some point of time. I, having had this dubious distinction of having flirted with the Film Society movement for some time, I would like to say that that happened because in the 60s, in the name of giving exposure to a lot of people to European cinema and cinema from other parts of the world, so certain relaxations were made for the film societies to screen films. They used to get an exemption, and which meant that you didn't have to go through the whole process of censorship, which the Indian films were subjected to. So with this exemption certificate, the film societies could screen films from all over the world in their original form, okay? And there were certain countries, particularly the erstwhile East Bloc countries, which made it a part of their policy to promote their cinema, which was very good. They used to make very good cinema, and their governments used to bring the 35mm prints of such films and distribute these among the film societies in the country so that they get an opportunity to view these films. Now, what happened was, in trying to gain exposure to this kind of world cinema, this degenerated among a particular section of the audience to an exposure of a different kind, to an exposure of the human skin, of naked bodies, which were, the kind of focus shifted. And that's why I think the Film Society lost its track at some point of time. Now, that was around the time again when Chiduda thought of making a few films, like, Bilet Ferot or Amodini and so on. So would you like to care to talk a little bit about the kind of films that he tried to make or did make, and with what kind of a thought process that did he embark on making these kind of films? Aparna?
There was many years difference between Bilet Ferot and Amodini, actually. Amodini he had set it permanently in Shantiniketan. Bilater was made long ago before he went to Delhi. But what was common, I think, in both these films, and that was actually a part of my father's nature, was his interest in, his inclination towards the bizarre, the humorous and the bizarre. Because when directed, all these people come back, it's actually very funny. But all these directeros, the foreign returns, come back to their native Kolkata, and they get into all because they come with very unusual ideas, and none of those ideas sadly work. And it's very, very funny. But Amodini too was actually, but Amodini was these were actually three films: Shard, Gadha, and Rockto. These were the three films in the I remember acting in Rockto as Shomitra Chatterjee's sister, which was very funny. We were already always being paired romantically.
And my mother acted Shomitra mother. So we were all there in a way.
Right.
All fun. Yeah. And I enjoyed Bilater very, very much. Of course, all the problems of a first film were there, but the vision of the film was very humorous and bizarre and kind of sad that people don't accept new ideas. All of these kind of mingled, and that was Bilater. Amodini was much more of a feature film in the sense that it was one long film. But there too, there was a very interesting idea of the daughter of the Zamindar being married off to a poor Brahmin who used to work for them. So he was as they in Bengali they call it Chakore Chele.
Chakore Chele.
Son of a servant. And so he kind of, she refuses to consummate the marriage and so on and so forth. And then he goes out and he makes good. And then finally, I think they kind of, at the end, he has these two wives. At that time, they could have two wives. But what is interesting, and Sumika, your movie wrote a very nice review of it, Karuna Banerjee. She wrote that at the end, there were the 2 feet of the women on two sides and the man's foot in the middle. Then suddenly, in a very playful way, what Baba does is he changes it around, the 2 men's feet and a pair of women's
feet in between. Yeah.
So kind of posing the question, well, what if, So I think that was there was a lot of mischievousness about my father.
Yes, I was coming to this point. Chiduda had this very mischievous sense of humor, a kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of sense of humor, which always sometimes used to transcend into a kind of satire also in some way in his writings. Shomikda, what would you say about that aspect of his? Did he utilize it in his writings to be critical of trash and to kind of encourage a different kind of thinking as far as filmmaking and film viewing was concerned?
Absolutely. And since recently I was reading afresh Boinoy Chobi, because the last edition is so full of printing mistake that I took it upon myself to do a proof correction of the whole book, and I just finished the exercise. So read it probingly, and what I discovered was that his basic point to bring the popular and the artistic together, that is what he wanted from cinema, that cinema had to go to the people, had to reach the people, and be chobi, be the visual, be image, be cinema. So with that concern, even the language he used to talk about cinema was a cross between the popular, the jesting, joking tone, and the more serious concern about visuals, images. Great insights, great points that it brings out from Ray's films, for example. The first person who again and again came back to Ray to give illustrations, but always with that tongue-in-cheek references, the contrasts that he make, the connection that he make with the popular mainstream.
Right.
So, no, what I wanted to say was that it was all there. The tongue-in-cheek, all of that was there. But actually, as a critic, and I do want to stress this very important aspect of his film criticism, film reviewing, is that Baba was a very constructive critic. He didn't decimate a filmmaker ever. Even if he thought that it was not good, if he thought it was just not worth writing about, he wouldn't write about it at all. But if he wrote about it, then he would make an attempt to understand the filmmaker and do a constructive criticism rather than a destructive one. That was one thing. He wore also, I think, Raju, he wore his scholarship very lightly. He was actually very, a really renowned scholar of cinema and also of history and society, and the societal and historical connections that he makes. And when he talks about cinema, this brings that aspect out. But he always wore that scholarship very lightly. His book on Ray is really very grounded in Ray's backdrop. I mean, how he evolved. That I think is very, very important there, and constantly connects it to the historical and the societal. I think a very important aspect also, apart from the jesting and satirical tone, that was another very important aspect of his film reviews. And because we don't get such reviews anymore.
Yeah.
Incidentally, some of his best film writing in Bangla is on the popular films of the 1950s and 1960s. Excellent reviews. So objective, insightful, at the same time, incisive, critical.
Yeah. But not, as I said, not decimating the film.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
But that's also interesting that, he wrote that way about the films of the 50s and the 60s. The session preceding this one was a discussion with young filmmakers. And they also felt that the films of the 50s and the 60s offered a lot to write about, and subsequently there hasn't been much of substance of writing on those kind of things. So even that discussion was focusing more on the films of the 50s and the 60s. And Shomikda, you did mention at one point of time that, some film society people thought that, you can see films from any part of the world because you have a VHS, and you can have a VHS cassette of this thing. Even if you have a VHS nowadays, Shomikda, you cannot view them at home because there are no VHS players anymore. Even if you have your VHS cassettes, the players are not there anymore at all. We are so rapidly moving. Even DVDs seem to be out of vogue nowadays. You see? Okay. Now, talking of his sense of humor, there is a particular anecdote that I can think of at this particular moment. I had visited your place once in Silver Spring, not too far back. And we were having an adda, and Chiduda was there very much. He was already in a wheelchair at that time, right? And we were talking about cinema, we were talking about reviews, we were talking about people who write on cinema, and about some particular people. He was saying that, these people, you don't call them critics or writers of cinema in any way. And I butted in at that point of time and said, yes, Chiduda, these are all recycle thieves. And he said, touche, 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 and almost rolled off his wheelchair. Enjoyed it so much that, yeah, he was.
It was a very good one. Recycled.
Yeah. Yeah. And he almost rolled off his thing. Okay. Right. Now, I think we have to leave a little time for questions. But before going to that, I would like to ask you, Shomikda, like from here, where to? Film Society, if it has to have a kind of new avatar. So what is the path that it should take? What would be your description?
I think the Film Society movement should reinvent itself. And maybe it can start with the film schools that have now started all over the place, besides the Pune Film Institute and the SRFDI. There are film schools, film departments all over the place. But rather than constrict their activities in the classrooms, because cinema has to be with the large audience, a mass audience. Therefore, even the more specialized viewers need interaction in terms of reactions, responses with a larger audience. So if there can be a kind of a mixing with the more specialist film viewers and the non-specialist film viewers, and a different kind of film club, maybe begin with more fun, more of club activity, more of societal activity, rather than make it a grim affair. And I remember some of the early Film Society discussions when we fought over films, particularly Mrinal Sen's films. There were no fisticuffs, but really serious engagement. When I fought with Nityapriya Ghosh, I defending Mrinal and Nityapriya attacking Mrinal. There was anger, there was rage, but at the core of it, there was a passionate love for cinema.
Of course.
We want our cinema good, and therefore we're prepared to fight for it.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
if that could be brought in, we could maybe reinvent the Film Society, and the scope that remains beyond the cities, because the film audiences are not confined to the cities alone.
Okay, good. That is very good food for thought. We will take a couple of questions. You see, now there are usually no courses offered for asking questions in a precise manner. Sometimes the questions are also so long. Anyway, I'll try and see. This one question particularly is addressed to Aparna Sen. How can we access Chidananda Dasgupta's films? His feature film Pamodani was available on DVD till fairly recently. Bilet Ferot, a delightful film which my grandparents adore, is not available anywhere. I'm interested in his documentary films too, or he made several, especially Portrait of a City and Dance of Shiva, which Shomikda just mentioned. Also, could we have a digital repository of his film writings? I have read The Cinema of Satyajit Ray and Seeing is Believing, which were instructive and enlightening. He was our country's first bona fide film historian who worked in direction, feature and documentary and writing, and cine activism. So preferably the response should be shorter than the question itself.
I think the first, you will all be very glad to know that to celebrate his centenary year, we have formed a Chidananda Dasgupta Memorial Trust, which is trying very hard to get the films that the National Film Archives have. They have, I think, they don't have Bilet Ferot, but they have Amodini. They have
all the other films. Apart from Bilet Ferot, they have all the other films.
And the British Film Institute has Bilet Ferot. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get them, and for his centenary celebrations, we plan to have a retrospective. And perhaps we can also, put it online later for everyone to see.
Yeah, good. I think that much is enough by way of divulging at the moment, because it will unfold itself during the course of this year. There is another question from an anonymous attendee who at every session prefers to be called the anonymous attendee at any session that I'm moderating. Have film societies in some way democratized the world of cinema? If yes, how much role did film societies play in developing the modern Indian eye from the pre-existing linear perspective? Would you like to take this, Shomikda?
I don't think the film society has had a large enough impact to change the perspective of film viewing in India. The impact of the film society movement has been limited to a very small coterie. And this whole afternoon, we have been talking about the need for and the possibilities of further extension of the film society perspective and the reshaping, the reconstructing of film viewing in India. That's a vision, and that's a vision that Chidu started with, and it still remains our vision. We have inherited that vision, yeah. But it still remains a vision.
And it has to get transformed into a mission in some way or the other, right?
Actually, the OTT platform where you can actually get to see some good films. For instance, in sites like NUBI, you really can get very good Bergman and so on, that maybe people of the younger generation have missed.
Okay, now the last questions. I will club two questions together because both are from the same person, Aniruddha Banerjee. While film society and film criticism may have certainly exposed the audience of our country to a broader narrative, but in the essence of storytelling, why couldn't our film movement be as influential as a French New Wave or the New German cinema or Polish New Wave? Have film societies done enough justice to the iconoclasts in the world of filmmaking? So
Raju answered this. Raju answered this. You haven't answered any question.
Well, I was supposed to ask the questions.
No.
Right.
Take it on.
I think the simple answer to this is film society and film criticism has exposed the audience of our country to broader narrative, certainly. But what has happened is that the space that needs to be given to cinema of a different kind, the regional cinema and so on, the better films that are made are nowadays made only for international festivals and not for local audiences at all, which is a pity because they go from Cannes to the Cannes. They are shown at one or two international festivals and then do not have proper exposure in their own country whatsoever. That is because distributorship is not there, and film societies have done justice in a way earlier, but at some point of time have lost their way. And as Shomikda said, we need to rectify that. And there has to be a new reincarnation of the film society movement, which addresses these kind of issues. And we are all optimistic all the time. After the lockdown period, probably people will again go back to halls, again see good cinema, not just sit at home and watch films on the OTT platform. And as long as the discourse is there, I think there is scope for good cinema to be made in our country in any case. We didn't talk today about the Film Finance Corporation or the NFDC, but that is a story that all of you know. We did not repeat it now. See, both these organizations kind of died a natural death, which was not the intention when they were formed. So we need more such avenues of promoting cinema, which people would like to make of a different kind. I hope that answers. Yeah, sure.
I would also say that a very encouraging sign is that the dividing line between what we used to call art films and commercial films, which I never liked, has begun to blur. There are many films being made now that have very interesting premises, and people are accepting films like that. It is being done more, I have to say, in Bombay, and perhaps in some other regional places. But films like Masan, for instance, which is a very good film, films like that are made now and seen and discussed by people. I think that's a very good sign. We can't, while we have to take what was good in the past, we also have to come to terms with what is happening in technology today. So if you say that maybe we will be able to go back to halls, my God, I would love that above anybody else. But I'm beginning to resign myself to the fact that maybe the film viewing experience will undergo a change.
Yeah, it will certainly undergo a change. And then in this context, I would like to also add, watch out for Aparna Sen's next film, which she has just completed shooting and is working on the post-production at the moment. She just mentioned Masan and Bombay and so on and so forth. There are people nearer home who are also making films of a different kind, right? And I will have to say thank you very much, Shomikda. Thank you very much, Aparna Sen. And thank you very much, Kalyan. We missed you and your voice, but then we know that you have been with us throughout in spirit. Sorry that you couldn't connect to this meeting. It would have been wonderful if you had. So thank you, Anjum, and with that, it's over to you again.
Thank you, Raju. It's been wonderful listening to Shomika, listening to Reenadi. We really missed Kullanda and tried in different ways. I'm so sorry that Kullanda, you couldn't be with us because your contribution has really been missed today. But thank you, Raju, for, as usual, being the competent person in the driving seat and sort of taking this discussion forward. And we're very, very pleased and happy that you joined No Man No Earth Weekend 2021 for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity.
Pleasure. And all the best for this centennial year of Chidananda Dasgupta. We look forward to the plans as they get unfurled.